Well, I'm here with Joe Park and Tim Yu. Hello, Joe. Good to see you.
Hey, Al.
Thanks for doing this. And Tim, good to see you too.
You too. Thanks, Al.
So what the three of us are going to talk about this remarkable book. It's by Brandon Shimoda. It's called The Desert. It's got this remarkable photo, which we may or may not want to talk about on front. It's published by The Song Cave, and it's that thick. And it's more than we can handle in a ModPo video that's meant to be a somewhat close reading. So what we've decided to do is we're going to pick a few entries at the end of a diaristic prose poem, which starts in January and ends through December. We learn about what the speaker, let's just say the speaker is Brandon, and a partner named Dee Dee, and what they're doing throughout a year. And the prose poem is referred to by Brandon Shimoda as by its first two sentences, "My heart is racing, first morning in Tucson." So that's what we call it. And what we're going to do now is we're going to read the last entries from December 15th through December 22nd. I'll ask Joe to read the first one, then Tim, then me. I got the short one. It's a way for us to put orally into the conversation the text, and then we'll just talk about it without a plan. So, and then at the end of our conversation, I'd like to introduce into the conversation an epigraph of sorts, a prologue anecdote at the very beginning of the book, which we'll talk about briefly. So here now, to start us off, reading the December 15th entry is Joe, followed by Tim, and then me, and we'll go around. Joe, you good with that?
Yep. Okay. December 15. The moon is revealing the skin on its bottom. I always think of the moon when we see it as an homage to the sun. There is snow on the mountaintops, which gives a good feeling. Snow in the desert, though distant. There's a defunct labor prison camp in the mountains north of Tucson. Gordon Hirabayashi was imprisoned there during the Second World War. He hitchhiked from the Northwest to the desert. When he arrived, he was sent up the mountain. Japanese Americans, Hopi Indians, Jehovah's Witnesses, war protesters.
December 17th. The clouds are starting to separate and peel off the mountains in the distance. There is no one here. The library is dead, and the air conditioner, installed this morning by Faulkner's widow, is loud, unnecessarily forceful. Writing is slow today. I lack the will and want to watch movies. It feels impossible, though it's a mental deficit. The plague of loss and grief, the dissolution of people, the impossibility of bridging regret with more than a couple of frayed ropes. I had a dream last night that Poppy had no legs and moved around by way of a wheelbarrow. My mom couldn't handle it, so I had to adjust him, pick him up, rewrap his bandages, make sure he was comfortable.
December 19th. I have been staring at the trees. They are really something strange. I wish I could convert some molecules of what I mean into color.
December 20th. I often envision very small wooden bridges to exist in the hair of old women, wooden bridges exquisitely carved with peacock feathers. I haven't been feeling very well and wrote fitfully all day long. Wrote and read, watched the trees in the wind. It has been cloudy too, which I hate to mention for how pathetic it sounds to care, because clouds are so vital, but still.
December 20th. I'm sitting between two brass candlesticks without candles and a vintage accordion. We're in our friend's house for the rest of the year. House sitting, plant watering, keeping warm. I just spent an hour in a wooden rocking chair in the backyard. The backyard is dirt and rocks, but there's a swimming pool and young fruit trees. My back hurts. I think I'm being pressured by ghosts. Not haunted or inhabited, but pressured.
December 22nd. It keeps going because it vanishes. So, Joe, we have a writer. We'll just, I guess, for shorthand, call this writer Brandon, who is spending a year in Tucson, seems not to have a settled home there, seems to be living with some precarity, although it's never really clear, and is proximate to the desert and to the concentration camps from Japanese internment during World War II. So what, Joe, and then Tim, what would you say in general, or specifically from these diary entries, what is Brandon Shimoda trying to achieve as a writer, as a person? What are his goals here? Why is he doing this? Do we know?
Al, this is a really hard book, I have to say. And I really appreciated it. I mean, I really appreciate it. So, it begins with, I'll get back to our page, but, have I told you about my garbage book, Spiral Bound Garbage? So I think he's kind of making a garbage book in a wonderful way. And I think this is kind of literally house sitting, like sitting in houses. And I think this book, at the end of the one I got to read December 20th, it talks about being still. And then what Tim read, sitting between two brass candlesticks without candles and a vintage accordion, that's such a still life, it's such like a portrait. So I see this as a kind of series of like still lives. And I think in this at the end of the year, there's a moment actually of relief, in that December 15th, which is kind of surprising. So yeah, I think it's like an assemblage of detritus. I think it's still living with a kind of stillness, literally house sitting, and something nice in the desert.
Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think those are great observations, and I also really enjoyed reading this book, but also at times did feel challenged by it. Did feel a bit as if I was struggling to kind of grasp what was going on at some basic level. When you had asked us to read this section, you referred to it as a kind of diaristic piece. And so, yeah, it does have that structure of kind of journal entries, these dates, but, the dates are kind of unmoored in this weird way. They're, I think if I'm following correctly, it's, I guess it does kind of begin at the beginning of a year and go all the way to the end. So it does feel as if it's organized as a single year, but it seems to have this kind of repetitive or cyclical structure, as if the same things kind of keep happening over and over. There are not kind of really major events in a lot of ways. It seems to be the kind of, we're walking the desert again, everything is dark, we rode out on our bikes, again. And so that sense of, and then there's this interesting way in which it seems to be on the border between kind of realism and something a little bit more. There are these moments where it's like, did that really happen? Is that, kind of an invented incident, or is this describing something real? So, it feels diaristic, but then it feels also a bit kind of unmoored from reality.
So we keep seeing the desert, but he's in Tucson. So if you're trying to explore the desert, Tucson's not the best place for that. It's a really pretty city, but it's near the desert. So we have in the passages that we read and throughout, we have this tension between the foreverness of the desert, or at least the momentary stillness of nature, trees and so forth. But then we have this interest in specific histories, the history of the internments, and also this particular time in this particular couple's life. So I wonder, is it possible, this is a loaded question, Joe, but is it possible for this to be as interested in an ecological poetics or an environmental humanities or an eco-poetics as it is into an investigation of what happened to a particular people in the United States in the desert? And those two things can happen at once. Hey, there's a cameo. And then but they also stand separate. So can any kind of poetic investigation into the racist and discriminatory denial of civil rights internment of World War II and this kind of lovely permanence of the desert, how do those two things, don't they kind of tend to pull apart? How do we work with both of those?
I think your question is, for me, the kind of the achievement of this piece, which I think is considerable. And I have to go back to another entry to answer the question. This is an entry that I loved. It was October 3rd. Let's see, where am I? Okay.
Would you read it?
Yeah, I will. There are a few October 3rd, because based on the note at the end, these are like emails. So, this is, I think he did a bunch of emailing on October 3rd.
I think we should say that, shouldn't we? What he did is he wrote a bunch of emails during this year, and he would extract prose that he liked from those emails to people. Yeah.
Okay, so October 3rd, I have only ever gotten lost. I am even still completely inarticulate on the subject, especially now considering ways of entering and or re-entering. I take the desert to be my lady of solitude. I appeal to her. The desert is the landscape of coordinated disappearance. Nationalism always requires an enemy, whether inside or outside the nation, Angela Davis says. The vortexes of racism, oppression, profiling, and incarceration and silencing silence are widening so tremendously they no longer resemble such previously rarefied spaces, so that it has become redundant even to say that such histories are relevant because of the fact that they have not stopped, are not histories. The continuum is ongoing. The target is the whole. So, the desert is the landscape of coordinated disappearance. In some ways, that's literal. Like that's where they put this huge population of people that just get rid of you in the interior, right? But in another way, I think the kind of disappearance of the desert, it reveals the lie of the relevance of history, because these things have not stopped, and it's not history. Things just keep going in the desert. So the disappearance of the desert, it has this kind of, I think, a profound kind of preservation. And I'm from Albuquerque, so this is like real familiar. Like,
but you really know this story.
Obviously, Tucson's really different, and New Mexicans hate Arizona. But like, I know like a big trashy city, and I know the good feeling of the mountains, But I also know super complex and a kind of nothing history that just never goes away. And so the desert as a kind of space in which, history isn't the past. And I think, this is a little cheesy, but I think even that little Minor Faulkner reference, the history is never past or whatever, that's what operates in the desert. And like the space of the desert, I think at the same time, he's trying to, the inability to convey like the molecule, the color of the tree in the desert is the same. It's like he can convey it. It's like the desert can kind of contain this past, and all of these injustices are kind of preserved there and alive there and still there.
So you might even say, and Tim, I'm turning to you, you might even say that there's a kind of archaeological truth about this I would call it investigative poetry, right? Where can we find traces of this injustice? Well, in the desert, because the desert is always. What are your thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, I think that's, the desert as a setting for this thinking through of, the internment, the incarceration. It's actually a theme that I think we see in other poetry about the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. I mean, I often teach Lawson Inada's Legends from Camp, for example, in my class. And, there's something, but even, when you see, for example, the famous, Ansel Adams photographs of Manzanar or something like that, there's this jarring contrast between this, kind of sublime landscape and the kind of gritty reality of the camps. And, many poems about the internment kind of comment on the fact that there's this, they're taken out to, these beautiful desert landscapes and then imprisoned there, right? So I think that to the extent that I read this book as a kind of internment book, as one that kind of takes the internment as its subject, even though I think indirectly it's always there, it kind of keeps cropping up throughout the book. And so I think the idea of the desert as this seemingly kind of, I mean, on the one hand, yes, I think it's archaeological in the sense that you can kind of dig away these layers and find this history, but it's also this kind of almost featureless or timeless landscape whereby, and Inada talks about the idea that, the map of the United States is kind of this blank, and then you sort of draw this, in his poem, Concentration Constellation, where he kind of draws a map between all the different camp sites. And so it's a landscape that for Inada is kind of scarred by the history of internment. So I think, in the sense that the history of the internment's always kind of like lurking in this landscape, I think that's a way I see in Shimoda kind of being in conversation with some of these other poets who also kind of take the desert as a space. But then also, as Joe points out, this isn't exactly like the desert in some kind of pristine, pure way. It's the desert kind of as seen through Tucson and kind of in this sort of precarious urban dweller who's seemingly hopping from place to place. So yeah, I think that the desert is a pretty complex site here, and it's one that's kind of, well, it's interesting that passage in which the speaker says, I think I'm being pressured by ghosts. I'm not haunted or inhabited, I'm pressured. And that's a really interesting way of thinking about the weight of history. Right? Haunted is a much more common, even cliched way of thinking about it. But pressured is a bit different. I'm trying to think about what the difference is between haunted, inhabited, and pressured. But that seems to be like internment always seems to be pressuring the way in which the landscape's described.
Here's a big question following from what Tim just said, and this is for both of you. I think Shimoda is dealing with the problem of how one writes, meaning using words, how one writes about absences, right? You implicitly, or at least theoretically, writing words that refer to things in the world, particularly when those things are trees and mountains and snow on those mountains, creates a presence in the text. But he's trying to figure out, how do I write about absence, the absence of distinguishing marks in certain parts of the desert, but also just the absence of those ghosts that are pressuring the language to create traces of them. Joe, is this right? I mean, do you think what I just said makes sense, that this is an experiment in how you write about absences and let them continue to be absent? You're not trying to recover everybody. You're not going to try to pretend that they're still there. They're not. They were incarcerated and their lives were disrupted and some of them died. Is that a relevant question for you? And I guess the follow-up question would be, this is an experiment. You both conceded right at the beginning, as I would, that this is a difficult book, that this is an experimental book that isn't very transparent. And maybe that's what's required. That kind of writing is required to do this work. Joe, go anywhere with any of that.
It's interesting. I'm the second entry that we're focusing on, there is no one here. What you were talking about, absence, and the library is dead. And there is this attempt that's running through this section, at least, to build bridges over this loss, but it doesn't work out very well. And then, that bridging, the plague of loss and grief, but then the bridging turns into in the hair of old women, carved with peacock feathers.
Can you close read that image? That's an amazing.
Oh, that's a tough one.
I mean, what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
You're punting.
Tim, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, Tim, what's going on with that image? It's just seems almost folkloric.
Actually, I'll say one thing about it before I pitch it. This is like ridiculous. I shouldn't even do this, but I was teaching this past semester and we were reading, Marianne Moore, and I was thinking of like No Swan So Fine. Like it has that feeling of that more, like a sculpture of a bird,
Oh,
and
okay.
like, how she describes what's dead in order to show what's alive. Do you know what I mean? So like, here's a candelabra and it's all dead, right? But here, it's not, it's weird. I mean, it's not that it's describing this intricate thing to show that there's a real thing that isn't dead, but it's more, it's like what you were saying, Al, like there, and now I'm going to combine it to what you said, Tim. It's like, I'm going to talk about dead things, but that doesn't mean that there's like living, pulsing things that I'm secretly pointing to because I'm looking at dead things. But in fact, there is instead this kind of pressure. And, like this kind of active, there's a kind of key phrase in scholarship on Japanese incarceration, which is the sense of this absent presence. And I think you can kind of see that operating here. But I really like the way you brought up pressure, Tim, because I think, an active question for Asian American poetics, is like post-memory, as we go down the generations, how live is this? How much access does one have? Is it, and, people make these pilgrimages to these sites. That's not what he's doing here, actually, but he understands that he's just in it, up in the beautiful mountains, there was this labor camp, right? So, to kind of test the active but absent presence that he really doesn't have access to. But, it said he dreams that, his an ancestor has no legs, and that, I could do a much more conventional reading of that, tracing down through the generations from Poppy to Mom, to me, but it's available, but it seems like a dumb reading of a much more nuanced poetics here, that isn't, I don't know, it's much more into the kind of like material experience of like sitting in the yard. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that image is so interesting because it unfolds in a really unexpected way, right? We could, one thing we might expect is, okay, it's a metaphor, right? The hair of old women is like, small wooden bridges or something like that. And then, you could spin that out, as Joe was suggesting, into a kind of, ancestral sort of idea where, the hair of old women is kind of a bridge to the past in some way. But that's not really what the image does, right? I often envision, so he starts off by kind of imagining. And the first thing he imagines is the little wooden bridges, like the thing that is kind of non-literal is sort of what he's imagining. I envision very small wooden bridges to exist in the hair of old women, right? So it becomes this very material image where he's taking this thing that he's imagining and then he's literally placing it into old women's hair. So it's not really, it feels like it has the structure of a comparison, but it doesn't really. It's actually like I'm taking this object that I'm imagining and then I'm putting it into hair, and then the bridges themselves are then kind of extrapolated more. Wooden bridges exquisitely carved with peacock feathers. And then the image just kind of drops, right? I haven't been feeling very well. So the image is kind of left hanging there, and then we kind of immediately go simply to this more quotidian reflection on feelings. So, it feels more like he's imagining or even building something, I guess, more so than comparing or recollecting something. It seems to be this very kind of personal conjunction of objects. Mm. So, I don't know that any of that kind of points to me towards like, what does it mean? But I think if we look at the way it's structured, there are a number of kind of surprising turns in that sentence for me.
Speaking of the way it's structured, I think I'd like to reread the December 20th, the second December 20th passage, and ask the two of you, or I'll join, we'll just do this collaboratively. Can we do a close reading of the paratactic sentences? Some of them connect, but most of them come from nowhere. And yet we do have a scene. So let me read that again, and then we can talk about it. I'm sitting between two brass candlesticks without candles and a vintage accordion. So there's one. We're in our friend's house for the rest of the year, house sitting, plant watering, keeping warm. I just spent an hour in a wooden rocking chair in the backyard. The backyard is dirt and rocks, but there's a swimming pool and young fruit trees. My back hurts. I think I'm being pressured by ghosts. Not haunted or inhabited, but pressured. So we do have a scene, but we have language pieces. And I'm going to throw this one to Tim to start. But we also have this, there is no December 31st entry, but the second to last entry refers to house sitting for till the end of the year. This is the final house sit, the final couch surf. And I guess I would start by saying, I hope not too leadingly or too obviously productive or provocatively, that there's, I feel connection, Tim, between the wanderingness, the homelessness is not the word, but the borrowing house, the cobbling together of residencies for this year, a year that's largely of writing in Tucson, and the feeling of disjunction, dislocation, and of dispossession that is in the history that he's feeling the pressure of. This last entry, Tim, really does cry out for, like, this is not your house. You're just figuring it out. Yeah, there's a swimming pool. That's nice. You're sitting where the hell are you? Where the hell am I? What do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, is there a kind of parallel, even, very remotely being suggested between the kind of wandering structure of the narrative, of the, this kind of sort of year going from place to place, and the kind of larger, more traumatic displacements that the book as a whole is sort of engaging with? I mean, I think, yes, I'm guessing Shimoda would not kind of want to posit a really direct kind of parallel, in the sense that, he is housed, right? He is not, being imprisoned in that kind of way. He does have a certain degree of freedom, but it's constrained, right? It's limited in certain ways. That opening sentence, I'm sitting between two brass candlesticks without candles and a vintage accordion, right? It's almost like he's kind of placing himself in this space by positing these kind of random objects. And then, okay, that's where I am. I'm here with these two, with these random objects. But, you started off by talking a little bit about parataxis and about the question of, like, how does one sentence connect to the next? The parataxis doesn't feel as, if we're using terms like experimental, it doesn't feel quite as radical as, say, it could. It's not completely jumping from thing to thing. It still does feel like this is a journal or a diary entry. But there are these ellipses, keeping warm, ellipsis, I just spent an hour in a wooden rocking chair in the backyard, ellipsis, the backyard is dirt and rocks. So there are these gaps. There are these disjunctures. And the most obvious one being between my back hurts, I think I'm being pressured by ghosts, right? What is that leap? So yeah, I think that this sense of being unsettled, right? And I mean, maybe that's part of why the speaker is to some degree disowning the more dramatic language of haunted or inhabited, right? Those are ways of the past is haunting you or possessing you in some ways. Like, no, it's pushing on me some way. I can feel it out there, even though I don't always directly engage it, it's always kind of there, like nagging me in some way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think maybe that unsettled feeling does have to do with this pressure that that always seems to be there.
Mm. Joe, what are your thoughts on this?
That brass candlesticks line, it's really tripping me out right now because I think it's actually very similar to the small wooden bridges line. Like, it's kind of the same scene, like the two candlesticks and then the accordion. I don't know, I'm picturing the folds. It's kind of intricate, like the wooden bridges exquisitely carved with. So there's a funny, I don't know. It's interesting. It's so maybe in the second December 20th entry, he's actually doing the bridging by inserting himself into the scene, right? So the difficult imagination of the exquisitely carved bridges, maybe by inserting himself into this tableau, he's able to perform that bridging. But then to go to, what Tim led with and what you led Tim to lead
Yes,
with.
I was leading him a little, but Tim's a good guy. He goes with that.
Yeah, well, I'll follow the lead too. But I was looking up some more on Gordon Hirabayashi on the Densho Encyclopedia, which is a really important resource, but something that the book mentions in the end papers. And I was reading on Gordon Hirabayashi, and I didn't actually realize this. So he's an incredibly important figure, but I actually didn't realize that his episode in the Catalina Federal Honor Camp, which was the camp outside of Tucson in the Catalina Mountains. This is he elected to go there, and he was a principled, conscientious objector to the war, and he's like he's a figure of incredible honor and integrity. And so, like I love the good feeling. Just thinking about Gordon Hirabayashi gives everyone a good feeling. But that's a really complex case. So he hitchhiked. He was in Washington State. He requested to serve out his sentence for breaking the curfew in a road camp. A road camp is one where you actually did this labor to fix the road, and they had much better conditions than the WRA, concentration camps. And he elected to go there, and he talks about he loved it there, actually. And it was a group of like 45 conscientious objectors, and the people described here are Japanese American, Hopi Indians, Jehovah's Witnesses, war protesters. I mean, there is kind of a sense of community. It's a place he oddly kind of elected to go to. The majesty of the mountains was felt by all of these inhabitants. And so this is to say that the complexity of Japanese incarceration was that it wasn't all bad. And this makes it such a complicated legacy. This is why we can't compare it to other concentration camps. It's real complex. But also, a year of house sitting is also like an incarceration. Like in both cases, like this is nothing compared to incarceration. But in both cases, there's like a complicated shading to other feelings. My back hurts house sitting, but also it was a wonderful spiritual communion to be incarcerated. It's very weird.
I love what you just said, and I really think that his back hurts because he's had a whole year of sitting in chairs that are not the one that he bought and chose for his own home. One bad chair after another, long sitting in the library trying to write. His back hurts, and then non-paratactically, the next thing is the pressure you feel when your back hurts. He's reached this level by December of discomfort that is putting him in the headspace he needs in order to understand how radical dislocation can be, even if you're living in the 21st century and you're not really put upon because you've got your friends have given you a place. It's got a pool, damn it. But this is where poetry can take you. I really, really like that. I also like, Joe, you're talking about the comparison between the first December 20 entry with the tiny, intricate, exquisitely carved wooden bridges, etc., and the relationship to the candlestick. I really think there's a vocabularistic register that connects those two. Mm-hmm. They're both, aesthetic, rare is not the right word, but they're artifice. And ceremonial candlesticks, not too useful, especially when they don't have candles in them. Before we turn, this is the curveball. I am going to read the epigraph-like thing at the beginning, the anecdote, and have us each just comment on it briefly. But before we get there, for the purpose of supporting people who are watching this video and who are working their way through this poem, I'd like to ask at least one, possibly two, very broad questions. And the first one is, why choose to write this way? If this is your topic and these are your concerns, we're poetics people, so it matters that Brandon Shimoda chose this form. And how does the form support the content? It's an elementary question, but a really, really basic and important one. Tim, what would you say to someone who said, well, why write this way? Why not a lyric poem? Or why not a short story? Or how about a researched piece of nonfiction?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are lyric poems in the book. There are shorter, more self-contained poems, and I do think those approach some of these issues, whether it's of the landscape, whether it's of the history of the incarceration, somewhat differently. The question of why use the kind of diaristic form for this particular take, I guess I keep going back to that line of being pressured by the past, right? I think that there's a way in which Shimoda chooses not to, say, for example, provide a kind of non-fictional or a kind of narrative version of the history of the incarceration. That's available, as Joe showed. It's just a kind of click away on the internet, and Shimoda kind of gives us the direction to find that if that's what we want. But this seems to be more about how does that history, along with all of the other things that are present in this landscape around Tucson, how do they kind of pressure the language and the consciousness of the poet, right? I mean, that to me is kind of if there's a theme of this section, that's kind of what it is. Like, how does that pressure register? And I think that the kind of almost kind of prose poetic form of this diary allows that pressure to register in a very immediate way, but also one that isn't kind of structured or filtered by the formality of a lyric poem, which I think other works in this book do structure it, through the form of the lyric. But this one, I think, is trying to provide a more kind of, a looser kind of more immediate sense of what that pressure feels like.
Thank you. Joe, why this form for this purpose?
Yeah, I appreciate what you said, Tim, about being kind of looser and more immediate. And there is, I totally agree, an immediacy to these entries, but there's this kind of duration to it. If I go like old timey and think back to like Image and stuff like that, we have a year in which essentially nothing happens. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't do anything. I mean, he's doing a lot of things, but not really. He's just biking back and forth or whatever. And so, how to take, but he doesn't boil it down to the single. Like, there's a kind of intense, there's an intense desire to show the duration of that kind of absence that he's experiencing, which I think lends that immediacy to that pressure that the poem ends on. But I think the duration is actually really important. And I think, and it's weird, it's actually not repetitive at all. It's actually very weird, even though kind of nothing happens. It's quite an achievement.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you mentioned it, but I'll emphasize it, Joe. When you're writing a diary and when you're actually extracting from emails you send to people on those days, you're using the present tense. It's very rare to write a diary entry in which you're describing what happened a week ago or even a couple of days ago, even though you can, of course, to catch up with events. The present tense this is a self-constraining way to force yourself to stay in the present tense. Okay, the second and last question before we turn to this epigraph is going to be a lightning round for all three of us. I'm going to ask each of us to paraphrase. We're not supposed to paraphrase, and we teach our students not to paraphrase poetry, but we're going to do it here. We're going to paraphrase the last line of the piece, the December 2022 entry. It simply reads, "It keeps going because it vanishes." Your job first, Tim, is to paraphrase it. What's he mean?
It keeps going because it vanishes. Well, right. The statement is a paradox, right? It's, how can something that disappears also endure, right? How can it continue? And I guess the paradox that Shimoda wants us to kind of meditate on is, what if the past, I mean, it's the past that occurs to me here because of the context. Like, what if the reason the past seems to kind of continue in a certain way is exactly because it disappears, it ends, it sort of recedes, but then it also goes on. I mean, that's, back to Faulkner, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past, right? I mean, that idea that the past kind of endures even though it's, gone in some way. I guess that's how
I love that. Joe, can you top that? Paraphrase this last line.
I can't top it. I'll just narrow it and say, I mean, if I want to do a slice of that, it's that injustice keeps happening because it disappears.
I like that. I'm going to do a slightly different reading of the its, although I like what you've just said. If the first it is the writing, the second it is the X of history that is inexpressibly difficult. This horrific American state-led deprivation of the rights of a population of people, it vanishes if we look at the desert and only see the desert. But the writing continues to be present because of that. It is the goal of a writer to bear witness to the thing that most people look at the desert and can't see. I keep thinking of Claude Lanzmann's 9.5-hour film Shoah, in which he uses no archival footage at all. He points his camera at Europe and he dares you to look at the landscape across a Polish forest. He dares you to look at it and not see the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people at a camp like Chelmno or Sobibor. Take a look at the desert. You can see it. And because it vanishes, what is left is the power of your imagination or the work that a writer can do. So, I mean, I'm loading a lot onto that, but I think this is a statement of poetics, I think. I really like it a lot. I think it's theoretically very sophisticated and interesting. Okay, here we go. We're going to end up by my reading this anecdote, and all you have to do is, I don't know, explain. It's a weird anecdote. It's obviously very important since it's been put up front. And for those of you following at home in this book, you'll find it's the very first text that you come across. Riding in a van through the desert, a former kindergarten teacher told us a story about a Pakistani woman who was murdered in East Tucson. The woman was murdered in her house. The woman's mother suspected the husband. She told her friends, but kept her suspicion private from her daughter's husband. She lost a daughter. He lost a wife. He didn't kill her. He was a doctor in Pakistan, but took a job in Tucson as a telemarketer. He and his wife had 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. The 6 of them, including the mother-in-law, lived in the house where the woman was murdered. The daughters were young. The son was mentally ill and had recently been institutionalized. Shortly after being released from the hospital and returning home, the son stabbed his mother to death. His sisters were in the house, but didn't hear anything. They were in the other room. As I listened to the woman's story, we passed a tree farm. The trees were dark green in perfect rows. A cloud of dust whirled up from some kind of slovenly machine. I didn't know what kind of trees they were, pecan maybe. I couldn't see any nuts from where we were on the highway, but the dark trees, the long diminishing rows, and the whirling cloud of dust. I envisioned fetuses, pendant-like, enclosed in the womb of the trees. I thought of the daughters. Were they twins? Did they hear their mother being stabbed? What were they doing in the other room? The former kindergarten teacher said she taught both of the daughters years ago. They're at the university now. She taught kindergarten for 35 years, had just retired 2 weeks earlier, and was on her way to Hawaii. to visit her daughter and grandchildren who lived near Pearl Harbor. When I asked her what Pearl Harbor was like, she said, "There's still oil in the water." Oh, Tim, what are we going to do with that? I mean, we got to do something with it, right? It's not random.
No, clearly not. I kind of want to work backwards, right? So there's still oil in the water, that last statement. I mean, that seems like the sense of there's still a kind of material trace of this event that happened, right? It's still, and it's a very kind of dramatic and pithy way of saying that. Of course, it's not an accident that it's Pearl Harbor, right? The kind of triggering event of World War II, but also, of course, of the Japanese-American incarceration, right? But again, that's only being alluded to in a very indirect way. The most important thing is that there's still this material trace, right? There's oil in the water. It's literally still there. But then how does this connect to this anecdote, right? And the thing that I want to say is that I feel like this is a bit of a leap, but what I want to say is that it's part of what I see as the book trying to take something that is a kind of story about Japanese American trauma and kind of broadening it to being, thinking about kind of Asian American trauma or sort of an Asian American history. There's there's a poem a few pages later where Shimoda writes, "Asian American women appear to me in dreams," and that's so interestingly specific. It's not Asian women, it's not Japanese, it's Asian American women. That their particular identity as Asian American is very important there. So this kind of link between this horrific incident and Pearl Harbor may seem very remote, but kind of poetically it seems to work. And there the key phrase seems to be, what were they doing in the other room, right? The fact that these two girls were there and at some level perhaps witnesses to what happened, and yet they weren't, right? They were there, but they didn't hear what happened, did they? But what Shimoda seems to be trying to do is questioning the extent to which they really could have been there and not heard and not known. Is that possible for them to have been there? And what were they doing? What was that barrier between them and this, this horrible event that was going on in the next room? So I see that as kind of introducing a set of tropes that maybe sets up this idea of, like this material trace of history, but also like, what does it mean to be like in the next room when violence and murder are occurring?
Yeah. Great. Wonderful start. Joe, what do you think of this thing? Where do you want to go next?
Yeah, this I had to read this a few times, but I got stuck on she lost a daughter, he lost a wife, and that that this one loss is different for each person, and the kind of multidimensionality of that loss, which I think is an element that's running through this book. But also, this murder happened in East Tucson. They were riding in a van through the desert. And as I listened to the woman's story, we passed a tree farm. So this is a lot of an earlier question you talked about, Al, like where you hear something, the place of the desert, and how that these girls, he imagines twins or something, enclosed in the womb of the trees, that the telling of the story in the desert, in the van, where they pass, these girls become enclosed in the landscape in these trees, which I think is, kind of what's happening throughout this book in a very difficult way, that these, they can be enclosed in these wombs, pendant-like. But yeah, I mean, yeah. And then it's so interesting, the former kindergarten teacher, who has this kind of, she's like the bridge, between this story and then she goes to Pearl Harbor. I mean, it's how he like finds these bridges through the text.
Yeah, I really love her role. This is a prefatory, this is setting us up to be readers. She stands in kind of as a reader who embraces the responsibility of the secondary witness. She's not a primary witness to the plight of the South Asian family that, where the patriarch takes a job in Tucson as a telemarketer. There is a kind of 21st century style displacement one imagines there, or at least a rough immigration story. She is reporting that because she wound up teaching the daughters, and she happens to be going to Pearl Harbor for retirement. But Brandon elicits from her this momentary secondary witness to what's left of Pearl Harbor. She is the American who is not connected to the stories, who has to figure out, who's in a position of having to put things together. This is what readers wind up doing. It keeps going because it vanishes. As Tim points out, if you look hard, and I did in my Shoah reference, if you just look hard enough at that water, there's ships down there that are still leaking oil after all these years. You really can understand what happened at Pearl Harbor if you would just be a good enough witness to it. I just love how he figures the kindergarten teacher as the connector here, which gives us, kind of puts on us a sense of responsibility. And, Tim referred to the history. It should be spelled out. December 7th, 1941, the so-called unprovoked, that is to say, it was the U.S. was not at war with Japan, and that created the whole Allied Axis thing that then provided a provocation for the government to intern Japanese Americans. And we talked earlier about the complexity, ideological complexity of being a CO in World War II, of being a CO because your friends and communities were being incarcerated, not because you were afraid of fighting fascism, but because you found fascism right in front of you. How complicated it would be for Brandon Shimoda or any of us to go back to that moment and see injustice on all sides and have to decide that we are against a war. There's Brandon Shimoda avoids, it seems to me, brilliantly any of these easy ideological positions by using poetry. I think this is why the three of us love literary writing and love to talk about it, because it never does anything very easy. All right, final thoughts. Joe, my asking you to do this was, I think, your first encounter with this book, possibly.
Correct. Yeah, I have.
What's your general take?
This is a hefty book. You know what I mean? And I'm quite amazed by it. And actually, your reading of It Keeps Going because it vanishes. I think I like that order of meditation. I like the way how you're reading it as having two different antecedents. Mm. And I think it's kind of weird. I'm going to bizarrely link that to, like, she lost a daughter, he lost a wife. They're the kind of multiple antecedents, like right next to each other, like in that kind of adjacency throughout. I mean, it manages without a lot of fanfare, actually, all the way through. But with, I would say, to use the word that Tim has really focused on so importantly, there's a steady pressure all through the book, even though it has very different formal strategies all throughout, which made it also tough read, but excellent.
Thank you, Joe. Tim, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I found this book to be really powerful, but also really kind of beautifully crafted and written in a lot of ways. I mean, thinking about kind of its antecedents, Al, I don't know if you thought this, or Joe, I don't know if you thought this. For some reason, like, George Oppen kept coming to mind as I read a lot of the lyric poems, the way in which Shimoda kind of uses the line in a very particular way, because he was kind of sort of go back to that Williams sort of Oppen line. But then I also hear kind of traces of a writer like, say, Myung-Mi Kim, who is really interested in kind of excavating this past, but in a way that recognizes the kind of fragmentation of that past, the kind of difficulty of accessing that past directly. And so, while I think Shimoda brings, in a lot of ways, a more kind of personal frame to that, it is still that idea of this pressure that's kind of hard to kind of name or isolate, but that's always kind of present throughout the book that I think is really most powerful for me. So I think it's really kind of beautifully crafted, but also very, very powerful in its kind of, in its kind of political seriousness.
Thank you. The book is The Desert by Brandon Shimoda. And I've been talking with Joe Park and Tim Yu. Thank you both. You're both fantastic colloquists. I really enjoy talking with you. Let's do it again sometime. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Al.
Al.